Hello and welcome to KMBN 2.5. We're calling this 2.5 because 2.4 led to all of the read-alouds that we did over the winter break. So welcome, and because February is the National African American History Month, that's our focus for today's episode. The author of the book that we're going to listen to today is Renee Watson. And when Renee was 7 years old, she wrote a 21-page story, and her teacher told her, "I think you're going to be a writer one day." And she was right. So Renee's been writing ever since. Renee grew up in Portland, Oregon, and many of her books are inspired by the neighborhood that she lived in. When Renee is working on a new book, she makes a playlist of songs that she thinks her main character would like and listens to it while she writes. She's traveled all over the place, but her two favorite places are Oregon and New York. So she loves them so much that she lives in both places, and she goes back and forth between Portland, Oregon, and Harlem, New York. The illustrator on this book is Christian Robinson. Christian grew up in Los Angeles, California, and he was raised by his grandmother in a one-bedroom home shared by 6 people. And he actually began his career in animation. Well, he is now based in Sacramento, California, and has worked with Sesame Street and also Pixar Animation Studios. He has illustrated a number of books, many books. In fact, some of the ones you might even recognize. There's a book called Josephine that he was an illustrator for, as well as Carmela Full of Wishes, and then Gaston and Antoinette. You might even recognize his style. So here we are with one of my favorite storybooks now, and this is called Harlem's Little Blackbird, the story of Florence Mills. I first was acquainted with this book when a few years ago I dropped into a 3rd grade classroom to see what they were doing. And the teacher pulled out this book and shared this book with her class, and they did some lessons and activities to go along with it. And I just found it wonderful. Here we have this young lady who was making an incredible impact on her world. So enjoy Harlem's Little Blackbird. They called her Harlem's Little Blackbird. Her name was Florence Mills. She was born in 1896 and lived in a teeny tiny itsy-bitsy house in Washington, D.C. A house so fragile it would shake whenever a thunderstorm came. Mother said, "Don't fear," and she would sway back and forth to the rain's rhythm, singing the same spirituals that had carried her family through slavery's storms.
When peace like a river attended my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
Mother's voice wrapped Florence like a warm blanket. Florence started singing too. The louder the thunder roared, the stronger she sang. Soon the storm faded to a damp drizzle, and then the drizzle disappeared. Her voice had chased the storm away. Florence thought, if my voice is powerful enough to stop the rain, what else can it do? Florence had a hard time paying attention in school. Instead of listening to the teacher, she would stare out the window. The sky became her stage, and she was a star, singing and dancing for the world. But wishing couldn't change the fact that she was just Florence Mills, the daughter of former slaves, living in a teeny tiny itsy-bitsy house. Word danced around Washington about the little girl with big talent. Florence was invited to perform at a fancy theater. The night before the show, she practiced her routine over and over. On the day of the show, when Florence and her friends arrived at the theater, nothing was what Florence had dreamed it would be. "They can't come in," the manager said. He pointed to the sign that read, "Whites only. No Negroes in the audience." Florence used her voice to stand up for what is right. "If they can't go in there, I'm staying out here," Florence said. And with her hands on her hips and her head held high, she walked away. "Wait!" the manager yelled, but Florence kept walking. He begged her to perform and snuck her friends in to see the show. That night, Florence performed her best routine, and everyone stood and clapped. Less than 6 years later, her family moved to New York City. Florence and her sisters became a singing and dancing trio, the Mills Sisters. They performed at Harlem's Lincoln Theater. In the summer, the Mills Sisters spent their days at Coney Island. Florence never got tired of going on the rides and playing games at the arcades, but nothing was as fun as performing at the Surf Avenue Opera House. Reporters followed them everywhere, and there was one sister they adored the most, 16-year-old Florence. "Come hear the woman who sings like a bird. When she dances, it's as if she's flying." And she was. She flew from stage to stage all over the country, from the East Coast to the West Coast, until she landed at New York's 63rd Street Music Hall. It was 1921, and Florence won a role in Shuffle Along. The sold-out show introduced jazz to white audiences. Each night, Florence gave her best. Every part of her body danced. Her eyelashes fluttered, her fingers wiggled, she whirled around and boogied down. Night after night, she gave the audience a hand-clapping, foot-stomping good time. A very special thing was happening in Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance. All kinds of creative minds contributed to Harlem's cultural movement. Langston Hughes penned poetry, Duke Ellington composed jazz classics, and in play after play, Florence continued to mesmerize crowds. In From Dover Street to Dixie, she was so good, the cast was invited to London. Florence was excited to travel overseas. But not everyone welcomed her. When she boarded the ship, the white passengers refused to eat in the same dining room as Florence and her troupe. When she arrived in London, many people threatened to boycott the show because they didn't want to see black performers on their stage. On opening night, Florence took a deep breath, opened her mouth, and sang one note, then another, and another, and the audience was amazed. Each night, when Florence stepped on stage, the audience cheered before she even opened her mouth. She was an international star, and Florence thought, "If my voice can take me around the world, what else can it do?" After Florence sailed back to Harlem, Mr. Ziegfeld, an important Broadway manager, offered Florence a leading role. She would have been the first black woman to star in the Ziegfeld Follies. It was every performer's dream, but she turned it down. Instead, she chose to use her voice in shows that gave unknown black singers and actors a chance to perform on stage. Florence became the leading lady in Dixie to Broadway. 100 lights shined on the marquee, flashing her name. The daughter of former slaves who grew up in a teeny-tiny itsy-bitsy house had made it. Florence wanted to use her voice for more than entertainment. In the show Blackbirds, she sang, "I'm a little blackbird looking for a bluebird." It became her favorite song to perform, a cry for equal rights.
My heart is sighing, for love I'm crying.
The show was such a hit that Florence was invited to London again. This time, she was welcomed by photographers and news reporters, and she was invited to many parties. After her performances, Florence disguised herself so no one would recognize her. She went to hospitals to deliver flowers to patients, and she walked along the Thames River giving money and food to beggars. Florence kept giving and dancing and singing until she was too exhausted to perform anymore. She became very ill and returned to Harlem to receive treatment from her doctor. But there was not much that her doctor could do. On November 1st, 1927, Florence's song came to an end. More than 150,000 mourners flooded the streets of Harlem to say goodbye. Letters, telegrams, and flowers were sent to the family from all over the world. People who had a lot and people who had a little, politicians and entertainers, whites and blacks, gave tribute to Florence Mills. Even blackbirds came. Hundreds of them were seen hovering nearby. Florence's dream lives on in the singers and dancers who came after her. It lives on in the heart of every boy and girl from a teeny tiny itsy bitsy place who dreams of doing great, big, gigantic, enormous things. Author's note from Renee Watson. Florence's voice was never recorded, and no film of her performances exist. So how do we know she was so great? The answers lie in the reaction her peers had to her. Florence was so great that Duke Ellington composed the song Black Beauty as a tribute to her. Iconic performers Lena Horne and Paul Robeson said she was one of the best. In 1925, Florence became the first black woman to be photographed for a full spread in Vanity Fair magazine. When Blackbirds moved to London's Pavilion Theatre, the Prince of Wales saw the show more than 20 times. But her talent wasn't all that made Florence great. What made her a remarkable woman was that she used her fame and fortune to help others. There are things that made Florence a beloved entertainer. Her talent, yes, but mostly her generosity and her faith. Florence Mills was 31 when she passed away from tuberculosis, but she left a legacy of a beautiful woman with a beautiful heart and a beautiful voice.